Okay, so I completed the first, actually a fair amount of the build for the Tekin mid-motor chassis here, the conversion for the RC10. Sorry it took a while for me to get to this point in the build. I wanted to make sure that I was able to procure as many new parts as I could, new gearbox, new nose plate, new everything, because this is a fairly uncommon chassis. And so I wanted to do it justice with completely new parts everywhere. So the gearbox is brand new. That's the re-released Stealth gearbox. Not cheap. It was something like $80 or so. I wanted to have a black nose plate, but original black nose plates were up until recently extremely hard to find. But now that the World's Car is re-released, these are relatively common now. So I got one of these. And there are actually a few other parts I need to pick up. But in the meantime, I figured I had enough to at least get started on the rear end here, or to do most of it. So let's see. Let's start with I'll get to the active link suspension part in a little bit. I'll explain that soon. But let's just start with the build and how it's gone so far. The way that the gearbox works is it's actually what mounts first to the chassis. Is you basically just take the gearbox and you flip it around. But then that would mean that the input shaft gets flipped around to the other side. But you want to keep it on this side, so what you do is on the Stealth gearbox, there's a little cap piece that clips into a hole on either side. So actually on the top part of each half of the Stealth gearbox, it's actually a hole, and you just put a little plastic cap onto the side that does not have the input shaft sticking out of it. So you just have to pop that cap off, flip the input shaft around, and put that cap on the other side, and flip the gearbox around. Now the particular Stealth gearbox kit that I got, this cap piece clipped on just fine on the other side, but then when I tried to put it on this side, it kept falling out. So I had to use some silicone glue just to hold it in place. You can use shoe glue, whatever, just to keep it there. Otherwise, the gearbox went together just fine. No problems. The diff is nice and smooth. The parts fit, just fine. The motor plate here, though, this is specific to the Tekin kit. You cannot use like a standard RC10 motor plate and mount it to this. This plate is specific to this kit. If I had more time, I might have tried to maybe get this sandblasted and painted a different color. But the gold is okay. I don't mind it too much. So basically, the motor mounts, with your standard 4 screws at the bottom here. And then this motor plate mounts against the Stealth gearbox, with these 4 screws. And it also mounts to the chassis over here with this 1 screw. Now, since this graphite composite chassis is conductive, there are these little hat bushings, these insulating hat bushings you have to put into this hole on either side of the motor mount before you screw the screw in. But the screw is actually a little bit long, and if you just do it normally, you'd find that the screw protrudes a little bit out of the bottom of the chassis. So what I ended up doing was just adding another 1mm washer to the top here to pull the screw back a bit so that when it's fully tight, everything's nice and flush with the bottom of the chassis. One thing you do notice is that the bottom of the chassis is not completely flat. You have these little lips here on the sides, on the back sides of the chassis. And so I do wonder what they're for, because if the car has a hard landing, basically these bottom lips are going to be the first things to scrape the ground. I can only guess that they're there to basically to scrape the ground before any of these screws start scraping the ground, to sort of protect these screws. That's the only reason I could come up with, but I'm not really sure what the value add is there, though, because you're effectively losing a couple of millimeters worth of suspension travel before the car bottoms out. So, I don't really have an opinion on that. Let's see. Okay, so you mount the gearbox, you mount the rear suspension arm mounts, these white pieces here, and they tell you to not use the 3-degree mounts. Because that'll give you too much rear towing, and that's apparently not something you want with this mid-motor setup. It does turn out, though, there are a few things you have to keep in mind with these mounts. The first thing is This active link suspension has one link on one side with this arm piece here that runs on the low side, and then on the other side you have an arm piece that runs on the high side. So on this side it's no problem, but on this side what happens is the screw that mounts the rear of the rear suspension arm mount protrudes up past the mount, and so on this side that can scrape against this little arm here. So you actually have to take a Dremel and just sort of cut the top part of that screw so that you have clearance here, okay? So it's one thing to keep in mind when you put this together. You have to cut that back screw on the low, on the suspension arm that has the low side here, okay? The other thing is this particular arm, these arms are part of the Tekin kit. They're custom arms, and the reason for that is because there's a little lip here with a hole that mounts to part of this linkage assembly here, okay? So if you want to run this linkage assembly, you don't have to. Again, I'll get to that in a minute, but if you want to run it, you got to use these arms, okay? Otherwise, you can use the stock arms, but if you use these arms, they are actually a little bit longer than the stock arms. You notice this edge here runs a little further out. And it turns out that as a result of this, you cannot use the stock hinge pin to mount these arms. Right now I have the stock hinge pin in here just as a placeholder, but you can see it comes out on this side, but it doesn't come out on this side. You got to use a longer hinge pin. And this length here is about 2 inches. There is an RC10 GT rear hinge pin, arm mount hinge pin. It's like 2.038 inches. I think that'll work. I ordered a pair off eBay. When those come in, I'll try them out. Hopefully it'll be sufficient to clear on both sides, and I can put E-clips on both sides, okay? So that's something to bear in mind. Now, I did mention that this active link suspension is optional, and the reason for that is because the bulkhead, the rear bulkhead that comes with this kit does have static mounting holes here that you can mount your inner rear ball stud on, and you could, pick whichever position you want, and you could just run that setup, that kind of suspension system, so to speak, on this mid-motor kit, so that you're not using the active link suspension, but you are leveraging the fact that this is a mid-motor chassis. If you want to use the active link suspension, you got to build that active link setup, which is back here, and you got to attach these arms. Now, how does the active link work? Well, it's a little hard for me to show you with the lighting here because all those parts are black. So what I did is I drew it out. Okay, so pardon the not so super duper drawings here, but this is basically how it works. So this little piece here is this guy, and this arm here is this guy right here, okay? And then where you see this ball stud, that's this guy. So these are your ball studs left and right. These X marks are where you have screws where things can pivot, and this little T plate here is this movable plate where the ball stud mounts, and then this bar here, it's like a brace on either side that allows the T plate to slide around. Okay, so what happens? Basically, the idea is with this type of setup, when the suspension, say if the car is taking a corner, normally what would happen, let me get my RC10T out here and I'll show you. So with a conventional suspension where you have fixed ball studs on the inside and the outside, if the chassis rolls to one side, okay, what ends up happening is the outside wheel develops a positive camber, okay? And then if that positive camber is too aggressive, then you end up riding the sidewall of the tire where there's no tread, and the car can slide, okay? Likewise, when the suspension compresses this way, okay, both the inside and outside wheel develop a negative camber. So you have some amount of camber gain depending on whether the car is rolling or at full droop in the air or landing when the suspension is compressing, okay? And the idea of the active link suspension is to sort of cancel that all out so that no matter what the suspension arms are doing and how the chassis is rolling, the tires are completely upright, at 0 camber, or whatever your static camber is. And the way that works is basically this little T-plate here can move around, so that what that means is your inner camber link ball stud can move around as the suspension arms are moving around. So that means you have dynamic camber gain. So suppose, for example, that the car is turning right, so it's rolling to the left. That means this suspension arm will start to compress. Okay, and you'll see that this ball stud starts to move to the inside. So normally what would happen again is this outside wheel will try to go to a positive camber, but then that ball stud moves in to pull the wheel back to keep the camber at whatever your fixed camber setting is. Okay, and so the way that works is, right, this assembly would be for this side of the chassis. This arm raises up, and this, as that arm raises up and this one sits still, this link here pushes against this guy. This is another link in the center that can rotate, but it pushes against this, and it pushes this whole assembly out to the left here. Okay, and likewise, if only this arm moves up, it pushes this link and it pushes this whole T-plate over to this direction. Now, what happens when both suspension arms compress? Like say you're coming off a landing, okay? Then what happens is as this suspension arm moves up and this suspension arm moves up, each of these guys here, these links, that would be these guys here, they each want to move towards the center of the chassis. And so what ends up happening is they cause this piece here to rotate around this point here. Okay, so that's how they enabled a suspension link system where you can have, you know, the car can lean under cornering in one direction or the other, and you could have this, this piece move in or out. And then if both suspension arms are moving, this sits still. This doesn't move at all. And you just have this guy moving rotationally to accommodate the fact that both suspension arms are compressing. Okay, so that's kind of a neat little setup there. Let's see, is there anything else I wanted to mention here? Well, yeah, I think that's it for now. This is where I am in the build. Basically, this is all set up. Again, you don't have to use this active link suspension. If you want to, you could just take that out and use these fixed positions here for your inner rear ball stud. But I figured I'd try it out because it's kind of interesting and it's unique to this chassis. The only downside is that it does seem to limit your total suspension travel, because eventually, you know, as say if both suspension arms are moving up because the suspension's compressing, this will rotate and then it'll lock up as these two links try to touch each other. So there is a limit to exactly how much droop you can get and how much total compression you can get on either side of the chassis. So that is a limitation here, okay? And there is a little bit of binding in it. You try to set it up so that when you screw each of these pieces in, it's tight enough to hold it in place, but just loose enough to get free movement, but you have a lot of moving parts here. Okay, so it's more overall friction in the suspension than if you did not use it. Okay, so that is another disadvantage, but it's still kind of neat. In time, of course, I'll get through the rest of the build. I still have to get another couple of parts here or there. I'll finish the rear. I do have the rear shocks here somewhere in this pile, so I'll put those on. I got to do the rear drivetrain. I want to get brand new CVDs for the rear, so I'll do that at some point. And then once the rear is all done, I'll go to the front and put the front on. Basically, all you do with the front is take it off your old RC10 and plop it onto this. There's nothing special you got to do there, so that's just kind of normal. Steering rack, I am leaning towards using this A&L steering rack just because it's different, but I do have a stock steering rack. I also have this blue aluminum steering rack that was in the blue RC10 that I put together a few months ago. You can go watch those videos. So, yeah, in time I'll have some more stuff on this and I'll make another video. So thanks for watching.